For those of you who have heard the introduction to this series called The Cosmology of the Soul, the introduction was called, the larger reality of the piece are the 12 foundations of what I call Unitive Psychology. And each time as we begin a foundation, I will read the foundation, and while I'm reading it, the screen will have a copy of it so you can read along with me as we do it. It'll be helpful, I think, for everybody to have the text there. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to do a little piece that's an aside, in a way, and then we'll go on. I'll read it again, and we'll go from there to exegete it, to talk about it. So, foundation number 2 of Unitive Psychology. Every being, living and non-living, is unitive with all that exists, both in its interior as well as in its form. The unitive context for all humans and all human cultures is the biosphere in any present moment. Again, the unitive context for the biosphere is Earth, with her life systems of soil, air, water, and energy. The unitive context for Earth is the sun-planet system, this galaxy, this universe, and ultimately the infinite consciousness from which it emerges and is sustained in being. Thus, context can be thought of as a dimension of self. Now, as I noted, I'm going to begin this with a bit of an aside, but it really does apply to what we're going to be saying. And should it need to be deleted for time purposes, this is the part to delete. I attended a Eucharist on 10/3, on October 3rd, 2017, where a young priest, obviously new at the job, attempted a sermon of comfort to the half-dozen of us that were attending. He was doing fine until quoting the president in something like this, quote, "President Trump referred to the massacre in Las Vegas as absolute evil. Had Obama said it, the moral authority born of felt grief would have been the word, the logos within the words. My heart caught fire, and I could barely hold back from saying, he ought to know about evil." Trump, that is, not Obama. My heart caught fire, and I sat there thinking to myself the following. Prophets are not future tellers. They extrapolate the future by looking deeply into the present. So to turn them into fortune tellers or anything like that is a silly but popular approach to them, because they're speaking from the past, and we can see by reading them that they were right about what was then their future. Hebrew prophets, so often read in Christian churches, were mostly mystic poets compelled to speak by inner imperative. In other words, they couldn't not speak. It wasn't something they did because they thought they should. They couldn't not speak. And the political content in what they said is truly eternal. It applies now, it applies in every century, and it's basically a simple decency to all levels of the created order and the ability to see them as sacred. Not just each other, though we do a poor job even at that. Not just our children, those we allow to survive the womb, but all creatures, all creation, because it's all context for each of us. Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, Bernie Sanders, these are just three contemporary examples of Hebrew prophecy. Bernie was telling the truth. Dylan was telling the truth. At 19, he stared down neo-Confederates. At 19 years old, 25 years old, he stood there playing the guitar and singing right into the face of neo-Confederates. Trump has no position on moral issues, none whatsoever. And he should not be afforded that illegitimate place in the context of the Western tradition of either Judaism or Christianity. That is just the way it is. My failure to cry out myself because I was in church can only be attributed to moral cowardice on my part. And it won't happen again. Trump, the congenital liar, Trump, the compulsive lecher, does Trump represent values that are inherent in the Hebrew prophetic tradition? I don't think so. Deference to the poor and vulnerable? Come on. Honest dealings in pursuit of justice? Come on. Respect for nature? Come on. Respect for the indwelling spirit in each of us? Please. Why do young people walk away in disgust? Why are so many churches and seminaries empty? Devising trite and silly programs will not energize young people because they're not programs, they're cheap tricks. They're cheap tricks. And we're facing a generation who in 1 second can know anything. Anything. And they're going to be fooled by some silly little felt banners or something? I don't think so. Yeshua was no goody-goody. He can be quoted as saying, "Be hot or cold, for the lukewarm are vomit in my mouth." That's from Revelation, it's the book of Revelation, if you want to look it up. Young people crave truth. Hebrew truth, Yeshua truth, Krishna truth, Taoist truth, red man truth, black man truth, first people's truth, truth. Pilate answers for the culture, truth. What is that? I'm reminded of some lines from my first prophecy poem called Outrage. And this is the line. Corruption in high office affecting the whole. O my people, what foul fluid filters through our souls? What deep shame betrays our attempt at laughter? These 12 foundations speak of contexts. Foundation 2 does so precisely. It speaks of contexts in which the foul fluids of corruption infect the whole. My hope is that there will be fewer. My prayer is that there will be fewer days that live in infamy. So, what is the relationship between mental and emotional health and the created order? The health of the planet and the life community? Foundation number 2 is a door into that discussion. And it seems separate from psychology only because it's never been considered deeply enough. We cannot have a healthy organism in a polluted environment. So with each one of these foundations, I'm going to read the full text of the foundation, and you can find these in my book, The Third Covenant, Section 3, which was written by my daughter, Rebecca. And so what I'll do at the beginning of each one, I will read the whole one. It'll appear on the production of this, and then I will break it into, in this case, it's 5 constituent statements, and we'll look at each of those. And that should give you the experience of what it is I'm trying to talk about, opening the word psycheology to its larger psyche logos, the logos of soul, because that is what the word means. It's the logos of soul, and that includes the entire created order, and as well as our own interiority. And that's why when it's really talked about, you can feel it, not just hear it, but you can feel what's being said, because it's being said as you by me, because ultimately we're part of the same larger context, the same larger logos, the same universal soul. So, here is foundation 2. Every being, living and non-living, is unitive with all that exists, both in its interior as well as its form. The unitive context for all humans and human cultures is the biosphere in any present moment. Again, the unitive context for the biosphere is Earth, with her life systems of soil, air, water, and energy. The unitive context of Earth is the sun-planet system. It's sun-planet system. It's one system. This galaxy, the universe, and ultimately the infinite consciousness, or it could be put the way I started, the infinite soul, or presence of what, the thinking of God, sacred thought. God is not the name for God in any tradition that I know. It's a catch-all phrase. But sacred is just as good. So ultimately, the infinite consciousness from which it emerges and is sustained in being. Thus, context can be thought of as a dimension of self. Every being, living and non-living is unitive with all that exists, both in its interior as well as in its form. That's the first of 5 statements inherent in Foundation 2. So it could be broken down into 3 explanatory topics. The first would be, everything is itself and no other. And that comes under the term differentiation in Thomas Berry's thought. Second, everything has a within, a sentience, a sensitivity. We're reminded of Buddhism here. All sentient beings, anything with interiority, which, by the way, we now know is everything there is, from the quantum all the way to the galactic. On every level, everything is sentient. It responds. It may not think or have a cognitive component, but nothing is dead. Nothing. Nothing is dead because it's all embedded in a universal field of consciousness. And we've called that by many names in many cultures. The third is everything is unitive. So we could do it this way between you and me. You're not me, and I'm not you. However, number 2, we are both sentient. We both have an interiority, an inner sensitivity. And so we can feel each other's presence. Oh, you are me. I am you. All 3 are true. And if you lose the interactivity with that trinity, if you lose all 3, you veer off into something crazy. Either you're only matter, or you're only spirit, or you're only universal, man, pass the joint. So number 1, I make no claims of expertise in any of the 12 or so disciplines in which I work. But I am adept at the synthesis which unites them all in one new discipline, which I call unitive thought. So when we're looking at the field of consciousness in which things are embedded in different ways through the 5 statements, we're going to be talking about the progressive embedding. These are the levels at which it all takes place. The subatomic, or quantum, the atomic, the molecular, the megamolecular, the cellular, the species/individual being, the ecosystemic, the bioregional, the continental, the planetary, solar systemic, galactic, and universal. On every level, everything is floating in a sea of consciousness. We could call it the sea of wakefulness, something like that. It's where the dark sleep of the sacred awakens into this multi-level, totally interactive and embedded sequence of expressions that we call the universe. Each of them at every level, from the quantum all the way to the universal, every single level has an associated field of influence. And when I say field, a good image that always I think is helpful is to think about a horseshoe magnet underneath a tin, a piece of tin. And we take a handful, we don't see anything there. It's all invisible. And yet, we take a handful of filings and whoop, they exhibit the field. Well, if with that image, just with that simple image, we can imagine that happening in different ways and through different processes at every single level of creation. Everything has an associated field of influence. Given this, how do we see each other? And if our clients were, let's pretend you were my client, right? If they are to feel their own invisibility and awaken, therefore, to the soul of who they are, the only way that can be done, if you were a counselor or a teacher or whatever it is you do, this technological presentation, it can only be done effectively if we're in touch with the invisible. And the only way we get in touch with the invisible is to be in relation with the invisible. So let's take a counselor or a doctor of psychology, whatever it might be. And the person comes in, their client, and they're all shut down. They're all banged up. They've been brutalized by life. They have folded in on themselves. And people, I spoke nationally for 8 years to other doctors, MSWs, and so forth. And people oftentimes, almost every time I spoke, I did 6.5-hour sessions of seminar work with them. And almost every time somebody would say, well, this is awfully philosophical. Isn't there something I can take back and put into my practice? And I would say, no, there isn't. There are no tricks. That's why you can't trick young people. There are no tricks. All there is authenticity. And the word author is right in there. The author of life itself, the author of your own experience. So what happens is really, when a person comes into the office, they sit down and they've lost touch with their own soul. And they're in a culture that tells them that, that kind of talk has no place in psychology. Psycheology, soulology, got no place. Talk about that. But if they can feel your presence, really feel it, they'll feel their own because it's the same presence. This is good for bringing up children, too. If they can feel what's going on in you, then they will awaken to their own because it's the same one. It's the same one. But if you're shut down and you're writing prescriptions for psychotropic drugs only, or you've got some kind of prescription in your mind of what, an effective intervention or whatever might be, and all of them have value. I'm not a fundamentalist about any of this, but ultimately, we awaken to the soul in psycheology when we're able to feel our own, and when we feel our own, it's because we're in touch with someone else's. There are no tricks. And I would tell them that. I'd say the only thing you get to sell is authenticity. So get to work on your own journey, because it doesn't matter where you are in it. As long as you're trying and are in it, they will feel the invisible in you. There are no tricks. So you could call this kind of no tricks counseling. We are talking about, after all, 12 foundations of unitive psychology. So I'm trying to do both, to talk about our context and our actual functioning. So our sources are all the same, and ultimately, and as trite as it sounds, ultimately, it's love. Ultimately. We can't love ourselves unless we're loved. It's really that simple. And that's why if we're not encouraged and we're not given real encouragement, not fake stuff, not sugar replacements or sugary stuff, but something real, yes, you can do this. not the lie that you can do anything. It's not true. I'm 5'6". I hope Trump didn't hear that. I'll be Little Albert from here on in. Little Albie. That's who I'll be. I'll take it on now. I'm Little Albie with a bald head and a pot belly. That's who I am. So in case this ever gets to you, you've got your stuff, Mr. Tramp. Typo, Mr. Trump. Sorry. So, as I mentioned in the introduction to this series, which I called Cosmology of the Soul, the bending and blocking of that universal consciousness in us will bend and block the consciousness in our children. Because the one thing that they have to feel is what's real. And what they're calling real is not real. It's not. This whole idea that we are our portfolios, that whole thinking, it's not true. We are the love that we can make present in our souls to their souls. And they will, what you fell in love with in my daughter was in fact the presence of her soul. And that is because her mother and I made that what our riches would be. We focused on that. And we still are, still at it. So, they are them and no other, but they, like us, are sensitive. They, like us, are unitive with all beings. Their story represents their cognitive knowledge of themselves. Their affect and instincts are their feeling state. Their soul is the locus of eternal consciousness in each of us. We're part of a universally sacred creation that fluctuates out of the sacred darkness of God and becomes the body of God in light. And that's how most stories begin. Most cultural stories. In the beginning, and then it follows from there. So, statement number 2, the unitive context for all humans and all human cultures is the biosphere in any present moment. Now, I really love Carl Jung's talking about archetypes and all of that, how there is this collective series of symbols that are present in the human psyche, passed on from way, way back. But I think it's more accurate, and only slightly so perhaps, to think of the biosphere and its presence now. I mean, right now, in whatever now you're in, right? There are whales breaching. There are eagles and hawks diving. There are horses galloping. There are rodents burrowing. There are fish swimming. This is all going on right now, and it's always and only now. So what is really going on archetypally? The planet is going on. And all of that is part of the same invisible consciousness that is present in us as soul. Even the word animal, right? It's anima. It's Latin for soul with an L on it. Animal. And in soul being. Along comes Descartes and says, no, these are just machines. Biological machines. And so when you cut their leg off and they're screaming, it's just a reaction of the machine. It's got nothing to do with pain. Now we're here, and so are they, and they're flowing through us, and we're their conscious, their self-reflexive consciousness. We'll get to that in a minute. So there are several convergent envelopes surrounding and comprising the planet Earth. And for those of you who have had any acquaintance at all with Confucius, Confucius deals in these circles, these concentric rings. If all is well with the individual, all will be well in the marriage. If all is well in the marriage, all will be well in the family. If all is well in the family, all will be well in the neighborhood, town, city, and so on and so forth, all the way out to the universe. So these circles are kind of like that. They're convergent. They're wrapped around the entire planet. And the way that they were named scientifically and through Teilhard de Chardin were the lithosphere, which is the rock body. Lithos is rock, so the rock body of the Earth. And by the way, nuclear warfare would not end the Earth, but what it would do is burn off the biosphere and leave it a silent stone, leave the Earth, the rock body, the lithosphere, a silent stone going around the sun. Sunrise, sunset, and nothing there that lives. That's nuclear war. And when my wife Carol and I joined an organization called Beyond War back in the 80s, we had enough nuclear power to take life off the planet 8 times in an afternoon. 8 times. So nothing would be left but stone and maybe ashes. The hydrosphere, hydrous is water, hydrosphere, the planetary waters. And of course, the major presence is in the sea, but also the lakes and rivers and the hydrologic cycle, where steam rises up and then falls down as rain, and there is this exchange that causes life to happen, water-based life. The atmosphere, the air, is wrapped all the way around. It's all layered. All of these are layered too. Every single one of them is layered. The lithosphere has the core, the mantle, and the crust of the Earth. The hydrosphere has various temperature levels and light levels. Everybody's felt that in diving into the pool as a kid. The water is warm and then suddenly, woo, it gets cold if you're in a pond or the ocean. The atmosphere, the biosphere, all that lives, bios, life, and the noosphere, humans. Noosphere is the sphere of knowing. That's human culture, humans and all their cultures. So the client or student is shown that there is a context for his or her life, that they are a manifestation of the wonder. Wonder has been exiled from it all. Wonder, just the spiritual function of wonder. I mean, even the primates watch sunrises and sunsets. Even the primates, all the way up to the gorilla and a chimpanzee. So human cultures, humans and their culture, are this other convergent circle. We're around the Earth. We're wrapped around the Earth. And most of us are living like strangers here, when in fact, we truly are at home. The biologos is sacred life in a larger context. The logos of the biosphere is sacred life in a larger context. Life and life as soul are not a temptation to avoid nor a problem to solve. Life is an expression of sacredness, and the proper response is wonder. It's like falling in love with all of it. The biosphere is not an idea, it is a community of species within species, and life, the life of the soul, is the glue which binds them into a sacred whole. As the first peoples knew, the creatures surrounding us are not separate in any way from the life that we ourselves are, from the very being as human being. The actual living creatures are part of our own psychology, the logos of our own souls. So here's a brief meditation that I'm going to go through quickly so that anybody who hears this presentation will have a way to not only figure it, to imagine it, but also to pass it on. I'm not going to stop and actually do the meditation. I'm just going to read the stages. Imagine first the biosphere, or that part of it in which you live. And we're lucky enough to be in this beautiful area called New England, and even more beautifully, New Hampshire. Imagine all the creatures of this land, the water and the air, all of them, every one of them. That there are creatures flying, like I said, and creatures swimming, and creatures burrowing, and creatures running over the land. Deer especially. I have deer on my property. They come there because they know they're safe. Imagine the humans of all kinds which make up your area of life, your bioregion. And when I do that, I note the missing component of New Hampshire Native Americans. We've got Winnipesaukee, we've got Piscataqua, we've got Sunapee, all these different names, but no full-blooded New Hampshire Indians, because we committed genocide on them with blankets filled with smallpox during a terrible winter, and we gave them as though we're going to give them something to get warm with, and they all died. So they had no resistance to smallpox. So now that you've got all these animals and plants and everything, now delete all of the species from the water, the land, and air, as well as all human beings. Delete them. No more form. No more form. Lastly, delete yourself and imagine the formless halo of light present as the glue in which we all live. I imagine this halo of life and our part in it, the invisible New Hampshire. Now come back to your own form and the forms of those humans which surround you. Imagine the animals, plants, birds, even the insects all returning. Extend your circles of life to include the surrounding towns, the state, the nation, the continents, and the planet, the whole planet. To become whole is to become holy. They're both the same root word in the Greek, holos. So it's not about becoming pious, sugary. It's about becoming whole and feeling the integrity of the sacredness of life. That's holiness. We cannot be whole without the whole biologos or biosphere in which we are embedded. We're embedded in this thing we just imagined. Can't see it, but it's here. And it's also beneath the skin of each of us. What is preventing your wholeness? Removing the obstacles to wholeness. There is our life's work. That's the work. That's the work. Is finding out what the real enemy is. Whatever is impeding wholeness is what the work is about. And psychology is not mindology, brainology, psychopharmacology. It's psychology, the logos of the soul. That's what it's about. And the biosphere is a single living manifestation of the planet. Any psychology that cannot inspire, inspirare, the infusion of spirit, cannot inspire that experience, is not unitive and ultimately not valid. ultimately. The psyche is larger than the body. The brain mind is made whole and healed by the soul mind. In the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and all the spin-off programs that come from it, there is this statement on page 5 and 80, 5 and 8, or 8 and, anyway, 8 and 25, pages 8 and 25, it says, we were rocketed into a fourth dimension of experience. Well, if we think of instinct as number 1, affect as number 2, cognition as number 3, which is right where psychology of the brain ends. Number 4 is the awakening of the soul. It's the soul that can heal the mind. The soul heals the mind. And that's why it also says in that tradition that many do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. There are those who are mentally damaged, but they do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. And what that means to me is the capacity on the part of their ability to heal the brain through the soul. And what do you say about a nation led by liars when it's honesty itself that is the healing instrument? How do you deal with that? What about our kids? Thomas Berry used to say that sometimes when he was with me. He was already older than I am now, and he would say, what about the children? What about the children? What about the children? And he would shake with intensity. What about the children? How can we allow them to be led by liars, bullies, racists? That's the meaning of passing our sins down through the generations. That's what it means. It's by not dealing with it, by not being honest. Religions are not real if they cannot open the soul, the psyche to wonder. If they don't inspire us, they have lost their validity. They are supposed to inspire life, not dampen it with guilt and fear. Again, this is statement number 3. Again, the unitive context for the biosphere is Earth, with her life systems of soil, air, water, and energy. So in order to underscore what we just said above, let's consider the sustaining role of soil, air, water, and energy. And here we have to really deal with a problem regarding truth and deliberate ignorance. I think it was the 2012 election where I saw the Republican candidates lined up. And the question was asked, do you believe or not believe in evolution? Those of you who don't believe in evolution, raise your hand. And like little kids in a 5th grade class, they all raised their hands. They don't believe in evolution. Why? Because fundamentalists don't believe in evolution. That's why. The deliberate ignorance that insists that there is no eco crisis presently arises from the denial of our complete dependence on the life systems of the earth. And the story I just said with regard to the 2012 elections is certainly true today in what we've done in this country, where we've made ignorance a virtue, some kind of virtue in being ignorant. And in doing that, winning the vote of those who are kept in that position, only to take 2 things from them all. 1, their vote, and 2, what would be a fair income and dignity. And then those very same people are forgotten. The lies fostered by at least two of the three branches of government in this country today give people only two choices: denial and fear. And both are detrimental to mental and emotional health. And why is everybody zoned out on opioids and opiates? Why? Because they're full of fear and they're jammed full of denial and they just don't know what to do. Life has lost its value. They are like a sealed capsule moving through a biosphere that is meant to be totally permeable. They're lost in inner space. Ecology is the study and measurement of the ecologos, the glue that binds the planetary life in a single manifestation. It can be imagined as glue. Anything or anyone who impedes that manifestation and those who assent to that impediment can be seen to be murdering the health of the whole and can therefore be considered evil. The biologos depends on soil, air, and water as well as stored sunlight. To murder those underpinnings of life is to mass murder the human and all non-human life forms dependent on them. And that crime is called ecocide or biocide, the killing of life. And to pretend we're not in crisis is to foster the death of us all. Does that have anything to do with psychology? Does that have anything to do with religion? Does that have anything to do with the Hebrew prophets? Eminem, a contemporary prophet that I was only moved to say today because I saw something that took place in his courage. Any crime family posing as a political or religious entity is just that, a crime family. And just look at the bosses. Any such political party or religious entity distorts their own reason for being. This is supposed to be a representative democracy, these United States, and to distort that in order to block the good of the people in order to rape the land again of its wealth is evil. Any president, premier, prime minister, or pope who so distorts the value systems of all human cultures is guilty of biocide. Period. They lack all legitimacy and can only be described as counterproductive, grotesque, hideous. Mental health begins by refusing to conform to the destruction of one's own context or habitat. Say, no. Not only will you not be elected, you will not have a voice if it's destructive only. So the last statement is this. The unitive context for Earth is the sun-planet system, this galaxy, this universe, and ultimately the infinite consciousness from which it emerges and is sustained in its being. You have it right there in the Hindu Trinity. Brahman, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the Lord of the dead. It's not really the destroyer, it's Lord of the dead. We begin Foundation 2 speaking of context regarding humans and their cultures as being embedded along with all life forms in the biosphere. Next, we noted that the biosphere is embedded in planetary life systems of soil, air, water, and sunshine. Third, now we note that the sun-planet system in the Milky Way galaxy and that galaxy embedded in the larger context of an expanding universe. So do I believe in evolution? Yes, I do. But the universe itself is also embedded, the whole thing. Its context is the universal field of consciousness, or the phenomenon of the sacred. Whatever way, we can't allow anymore to allow we can't afford to allow the disciplines to separate us out and say what's okay to say and what's not okay to say. It's a deeper First Amendment right. But even after saying that it is important to note that most of the universe is invisible. It's almost all invisible. I mean, just think even of this this room, almost all of it is empty. And that's the whole idea of Taoism and the putting of windows. What would a wall be with no windows? Becomes a prison. What is context with no space? Unbearable. So the universe is almost all. I heard a definition, among others, of the space within the atom. If we took the nucleus of an atom, it's about the size of a prick of a pin, putting it in the center of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the electrons are up in the dome, flying around. We're almost entirely empty space. So where does repression go? Right into the body. That's where it goes. And that's why in the very first talk, where I talked about the cosmology of the soul, the bending and distorting of the light, we are space. We think we're not. This is space. We think it isn't, but it is space. It's the fields and the electromagnetic fields within that give it this feeling of solidity. So all religions of all cultures have a shared ultimate goal: to name, understand, and to know personally that invisible dimension within themselves, within each other, within everything that surrounds them, and ultimately within the whole universe. And that's what the great masters like Christ and the Buddha come to, where they understand that I mentioned earlier, I think in the presentation, not today but last week, Na Myoho Renge Kyo. It means my soul and the soul of the universe is the same soul. So we can think, as I said, with the mind of God. No religion that I know of uses the word God as the name for God. It should not be controversial to use the word God as a category that means what is said ultimately, again, in the way of the 12 steps. God as we understand God. It doesn't matter how we understand it. Each of us has individual fingerprints. The soul has its own fingerprint, and God reveals the divine self through whatever master, through whatever tradition makes sense for that person. So when I use the word, I am referring to the universal field of consciousness. That's what I'm referring to. In the Western context, the word has often meant Holy Spirit or Logos. The French priest, mystic, scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin died in 1955. His life was spent in unitive work in theology, in mysticism and in several sciences. He died in depression and despair after revealing a new context for Western religious thought, evolutionary cosmology, geology, and biology within a doctrinally sound presentation of Catholic spirituality. He provided for an evolutionary Catholicism that was wed to evolutionary science. I want to say that again. You know, people talk about putting the two together. They are one if we have the right contextual understanding, which we were given through this man. I guess I should say it right out. My goal in life is to rectify the damage done by not allowing Teilhard de Chardin to apply what it was he absolutely knew in his own being. He was a renowned anthropologist, geologist. He understood quantum mechanics. He had a passing acquaintance with Eastern spirituality, and at the same time was a mystic, feeling it all, feeling the truth of it all, and a katholos, one concerned with the whole. That's what the word means. People think that what they think about the 60s was what opened the door to the non-event called Vatican II. It was the other way around. Vatican II opened the windows to the new. And I am going to say this through no authority but my own. In the mind of the Holy Spirit, the intention had to be to integrate Teilhard de Chardin into the modern world. And as always, the light was bent, repressed, denied because of fear of the political unrest that we saw in the 60s, the Kennedy murders, the murder of Martin Luther King. Vatican II became a repression and denial of the truth of the Holy Spirit. And it doesn't matter to me how many times I'm told, well, by what authority do you? I don't care anymore. This is what I believe. There was wonder in the vision of Teilhard de Chardin. Wonder is necessary for the health of the soul. It's as important as water for the soul. To feel wonder, to feel that bigness. That was what the 60s were, and I am convinced that the Western world experienced that Zeitgeist or Zeitgeist, whichever way you like the pronunciation, it was caused by the opening through which the Holy Spirit tried to change the West. He integrated not only science and spirituality, but also the East, and also he integrated classical and quantum physics. He had a beginning understanding, much like my own, of the shift of rules between the world of the quanta and the world of classical physics. And he was in the process of integrating them because he's a mystic. Thomas Berry, I first read Teilhard de Chardin in 1973 and have never stopped. I've read his entire corpus, or nearly all of his corpus, at least twice, some of them 3 times, because it's so beautiful. I searched for a true Teilhardian priest, but couldn't find one until I met Thomas Berry in 1984. Thomas Berry showed me that what he called roly-poly Vatican Jesuits, whenever he said it, he always let out a growl of laughter. Roly-poly graduate, Vatican Jesuits. These were the spiritual pipsqueaks who denied, destroyed, and ignored the great event of a new expression of the Roman Catholic Church. These were the ecclesial equivalent of raising your hand, saying, no, I don't believe in evolution because it's inconvenient. I don't believe in the climate crisis because it's inconvenient. It'll turn my voters away or whatever. Thomas Berry described the cultural pathology of the West as an addiction illness and gave me the title of cultural therapist. It was his creation. He said, we need cultural therapists. I said, what's that? He says, I don't know. We've never had one. Then he commissioned me to write my first book, Green Spirit, which is now called Cultural Addiction. Having accepted that role, I offer to the world, take it or leave it, I'm beyond caring, I'm 70. Having accepted that role, I offer this following diagnosis. 1, as with all addiction illnesses, the cause is invisible. It results from a shrinkage rather than an expansion of consciousness. Therefore, it is by its nature anti-evolutionary. It creates the infantilism that we presently see parading in the White House. B, that shrinkage of soul is the root cause of physical, mental, and emotional disease in the body and brain. Horribly, the use of the substance of addiction, whether exosomatic, outside the body, like drugs and alcohol, or endosomatic, within the body, are used to relieve the symptoms of the pathology they cause. It's a closed circle. What you need in order to live is what's creating the death within you. Only spiritual reprieve lets you out. In the Western world, ego selves parading as soul selves distorted and perverted the real mission of Christian spirituality / mysticism. In the USA, this distortion has led to the dizzying corruption we witness in all 3 branches of government. We need a Western perestroika. Perestroika is a word coined by Mikhail Gorbachev, and it means spiritual awakening, to renew the efficacy of the Western soul. We need a Western perestroika. This perestroika must begin with the convening of Vatican III and the institution of the Third Covenant. The Third Covenant would restore the sacred context of our lives by beginning the recovery of the Western world, because statement number 5 in our foundation number 2 is, because context can be thought of as a dimension of self. So a very brief postscript, and then I'm going to end today and leave the trouble of editing it to my producer. The suicides continue unabated. All addiction is a form of suicide. Homicide, pretending to be war, continues all unabated. The U.S. Constitution is a sacred document, impeded and befouled by little men. President Obama was a great man, and Michelle Obama was greatness personified as First Lady. We have slipped into a pigsty, and it smells that way. It smells that way. Pope Francis is also a great and generous man, a Mahatma, a big soul, a great soul. That's what a Mahatma is, a large Atman, big soul. I call upon him as Pope to convene a Third Vatican Council in order to restore the work of his brother Jesuit, Teilhard de Chardin, because it might already be too late. The energy of the Kennedy brothers drew its legitimacy from their source in Catholicism. Kennedy energy was derived from Vatican II. I believe that. I ask the Pope to consult with President Obama on the political ramifications of a Third Vatican Council. The first millennium was Augustinian. The second was Thomas Aquinas. The third must be Teilhardian if we are to survive as a democracy, as a people, as a species, and as a planet.